Hello, everybody. Nice to see folks.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, we're gonna wait for folks' computers to warm up, to their audio connections to work.
I'm in my office until my boss comes back with lunch, so I can catch part of it.
Shouldn't this be a continuing legal education?
I think so, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. Good morning, Rabbi.
Yeah.
And I are here.
Good morning.
You want some ice
Nice.
cream?
No, thanks.
We've got a little bit of a line at the door, so if we just pause and give us a moment as we admit people into today's class.
I thought it was Zoom only, I thought. You know?
It is just Zoom. I'm just being I'm being silly about the way that we welcome people, but it makes sense that just as in person we expect people to kind of trickle into the room, and so too it happens on Zoom as well. I'm going to start at 12:03, so we are a few seconds from the start. Thanks everybody. All right. For those who have their video on, it's good to see everybody. Thank you to everybody who's zooming in today for this discussion, this teaching about the Jewish view of abortion, or Jewish law and abortion. Listen, I recognize that abortion, questions around abortion, questions about abortion rights are very complicated questions. For some people, the questions themselves are complicated, and for other people, they're black and white. For some people are very touched by personal experience when it comes to this discussion and personal testimony of other people, and others might be more influenced by thought or belief or their sense of ethics. Some of us might approach the topic of abortion from an emotional place, others from an intellectual place, many of us probably from both places. I recognize all of that, and I also recognize who I am. So let's just be explicit, right? I'm a man, and I'm talking about abortion today. There are certain limitations to my human experience. I'm wealthy. Money provides access, and this conversation might be different if I had experienced a life of limited resources. I'm white, and the CDC reports that African American women are 2 to 3 times more likely than white women to die in childbirth. So I recognize all of those things, and they're relevant because most of us are influenced by our environment and our personal experiences. And as much as I think legalists like to think that the law exists in a theoretical legal framework, I've read enough halakhic decisions and legal decisions to know that there are powerful sociological forces that influence many Jewish legal decisions. Despite all of that, the focus today is intentionally a little impersonal. a little not about individual testimony and personal experience, and more of what does Jewish intellectual history say about the concept of abortion, if you will, or what is the development within Jewish law around abortion. I recognize from the outset that this conversation, when we look at Jewish law and the sources that I bring are going to be short. I don't know if I have any contemporary women's voices to present today. And that is in part because, as I'll try to show, that the boundaries around the Jewish position on abortion were really set by the year 1200 or so. And we don't have women's voices from before that. We'll see that there are definitely later voices that add to it or give detail, but those frameworks are set. And so what I want to do is I want to take you from the earliest Jewish sources, from the Torah, from the Bible, through the Talmudic tradition, through the early medieval tradition when the boundaries around abortion are set, then into, if you will, late or early modernity, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, to begin, let's see. The Torah has a few verses that deal with the topic of murder. And so our first question is, where does feticide, where does killing of a fetus, a fetus, where does killing of a fetus sit within the concepts of murder? Homicide would be the most, is it homicide, infanticide, or is feticide its own category? So when we look initially at the sources that relate to taking intent, a person taking another's life, we see the opening verse in Exodus 12. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see the sources that I'm going to talk about. I can still see you because my computer is sort of set up in a way that I can have these side by side. Your screen may be dominated by the sources. I don't know how you get to resize things. Okay, so in the book of Exodus, one who fatally strikes another party shall be put to death. As straightforward and simple as it sounds, in Hebrew, Hebrew's a gendered language. So the original Hebrew text is in male forms. Makeh ish, you might think, is that intentionally limited to a man who strikes another man? Or is it intended to be open in general? And what constitutes another party? Should there be a difference between if the party was 6 months old versus the party was 60 years old? These questions arise from what seems like a very simple statement around the prohibition of murder. And then we have another verse in the Torah, if anyone slays a person. So there's a different change in language from party to person. And it says, if anyone, why does it add the word anyone there? Because of these two verses in the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud is the authoritative Jewish interpretation of the Hebrew Bible for the purpose of making the Torah and the Hebrew Bible living law. So the Torah can exist, the Talmud turns it into living law in terms of the Judaism that we continue to experience today. So let me take you through this piece from the Talmud. If you're curious, the Talmud, let's just say the Babylonian Talmud is closed, is finalized around the year 500 of the Common Era. So we're now into 500 of the Common Era after the temple has been destroyed. This is a period of Jewish history that begins called Rabbinic Judaism, when we no longer have a temple because it's been destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. and we are trying to live according to the Torah. And so the sages are interpreting and writing law for how we're going to live. So here, I'll take you through. The Gemara is confused. Why does the Torah have to have 2 verses around murder? Why does it need to do it? It says it was necessary for the Torah to write these 2 verses. First, it was necessary for the verse from Exodus, which says, one who strikes a man. That's a literal translation. We saw that the earlier translation used the gender neutral term party. One who strikes a man. And it was necessary for to write anyone who kills a soul, a slightly different translation than the word person. Since if the merciful one wrote, in other words, if the Torah only wrote one who strikes a man and he dies, I would say that one who strikes a man, that refers specifically to an adult. And then adult means that you're obligated enough to fill the mitzvot. That's prohibited. But if you were to kill a minor, you are not executed. Therefore, the Torah, the merciful one, says, anyone who kills a soul. So that's the reason for, in one direction, for the 2 verses. And the other one is, and if the merciful one wrote, anyone who kills a soul, but didn't write the verse from Exodus, I would say that one is executed even if he killed a non-viable newborn, or even if he killed a child born after a gestation period of 8 months, who in Talmudic times was also considered non-viable. Consequently, both verses are necessary. In short, what the Talmud is saying here is that the killing, that feticide is not murder. For as it says, a non-viable newborn, or even a child born after killed after an 8-month gestation period, that isn't murder. It falls into a different category. And we even have then another text which explicitly talks about the notion of causing a miscarriage, which says, when 2 or more parties fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may extract, the payment may be paid to be based on reckoning. 2 parties are fighting, causes a woman to miscarriage. They haven't committed a murder. They have caused a miscarriage and they will pay a fine for it. So this is, again, a reinforcement that within the Jewish tradition, the killing of a fetus is not murder. It falls into a lower level category. And then we'll see then that the scope of how to then deal with this in terms of permissibility will vary. Interestingly enough, the very next verse in the book of Exodus, after the one about 2 parties fighting, says, but if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. And from there it goes on, life for eye, a eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So we're going to see later on in this conversation how these 2 verses in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, are translated differently, and that it's possible to trace, if you will, a alternative and perhaps Christian view of abortion to these verses through their translation in the Septuagint. But we're going to come back to that. So we've established, right, again, in this source from the Talmud, it makes it very clear that the killing of a fetus is not murder. And so then when is abortion permitted? And we have an explicit text from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is 300 years before the Babylonian Talmud. So the Mishnah is from the year 200 of the Common Era. The Talmud then comes 300 years later, 500. And so therapeutic, an abortion performed for medical reasons, an abortion performed because of the health of the mother or the fetus. The Mishnah says, and some of you if you've Googled this topic before, you may be familiar with this. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb because her life comes before the life of the child. A mother's life is in danger. She's having trouble giving birth. The child is the cause of that danger, and therefore an abortion is performed in order to save the life of the mother. Her life comes before that of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not have set aside one person's life for that of another. If it comes out, what does that mean? If the greater part has come out, the greater part, and once the greater part of his head, which once his skull has come out, one may not touch it. So once the skull emerges, then the child has entered into the world. We'll see another text that explains this a little bit in greater detail. But the basic idea is that life and birth is dependent on being able to breathe in this world. And so the emergence of the head, and I think I could show later on the emergence of ultimately the nose and the receiving of air in this world, that is the entry into life. And at that moment, then the fetus has changed its state from being a fetus to being a person. Is that, for the folks who have a head, I see some nodding. Okay, so if you will, life in its fullest form happens with entry of the skull of the head into the world and the taking of a breath. Prior to that, the life of the mother takes precedence over the life of the child. The other thing that this establishes is the conditions under which the topic is being discussed is concern for the health of the mother. That's what the Mishnah will be understood to mean. The woman is having trouble in childbirth means that her life is at risk here and not some other consideration. So Rashi is an 11th century French commentator on the Torah. And on this concept of the head of the fetus emerging into the world, he's writing on some prior text, which I didn't quote for you. He said, with a woman who is experiencing difficulty giving birth and is in mortal danger. And it is taught in the first section of this teaching, which I haven't quoted for you. The midwife extends her hand and cuts it up, the fetus, and extracts the pieces. As the entire time that it has not gone out into the air of the world, it is not considered a soul, and so it is possible to kill the fetus to save its mother. But once its head has come out, we cannot touch it, as it is like a born baby, and we do not push off one soul for the sake of another. Rashi writes, if you will, in the simplest of forms. He doesn't talk about so much about viability at this stage. He doesn't talk about the degree of circumstances that might be considered the mother in mortal danger. What he does state very explicitly is it is not considered a soul. Stop, please. Yeah. It's not considered a soul. And therefore, its status is lesser than the woman who is considered a soul, and we're going to do whatever is necessary for her health. That is going to be one of the positions that bounds Jewish thought, is Rashi's comments coming from here in the Talmud in around sometime in the 11th century. Similarly, some of you may have heard of Maimonides or the Rambam, who writes a code of Jewish law. And Maimonides will frame it a little differently. Rambam says, this too is a negative commandment. A negative commandment is something we're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to eat ham. Where in contrast to a positive commandment, which is something you are supposed to do, like give tzedakah, right? So this too is a negative commandment, not to take pity on the life of a pursuer. A pursuer is a legal term for someone who is coming to take the life of another person. This, involves, if you will, vigilante justice or defending yourself. The very notion that a thief has come into your home, the Talmud will discuss, can you use lethal force to stop the thief? The initial conversation begins with the Talmud saying, if a thief comes into your home, we have to assume that if the thief finds you home, then the thief will kill you. And therefore, their very presence in your home as a thief authorizes you to use lethal force. In that section of the Talmud, which is its own conversation, the rabbis express discomfort with this basic idea, even though they've just stated it. And they'll talk about, was it daylight? Was it nighttime? How did the thief come in, etc. Nevertheless, this is the concept of a pursuer, someone who we know is coming or can presume, someone for whom we can presume is coming to take your life. You have the right to take their life. And so therefore the sages ruled that when a woman has difficulty in giving birth, one may dismember the child in her womb, either with drugs or by surgery, because it is like this legal category of a pursuer seeking to kill her. Once its head has emerged, however, it may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another. That is the natural course of the world. Now, there's a lot of different interpretations about what Maimonides is saying here. Some will argue that he is explicitly not using the category of a pursuer for the fetus, because elsewhere in Jewish tradition, the fetus is clearly not acting with its own volition. And elsewhere in Jewish tradition, it will talk about how sort of heaven is at work in this moment. And therefore, we don't categorize the fetus as in the legal term as a pursuer. However, Maimonides, and that would be people who are going to emphasize the word like in Maimonides. And there are other people going to say, like a pursuer, was intentional on Maimonides' part to push it into this category of a pursuer. What this does is the fact that Maimonides has written the language of a pursuer, which again is someone for whom we can presume is going to take your life, is it establishes the other extreme in the Jewish view, which is that we have to be either somewhere between certain and enough of a strong enough presumption that the woman's life is at stake in order to perform an abortion. So what I'm sharing with you now is in some sense what David Feldman, who writes initially on contraception in 1968, then he writes on abortion in 1983. David Feldman will set this up in this way as saying that these two views, the view of Rashi, which focuses on the fetus not being a soul, and therefore you can take its life. The other is that the life of the mother must be at stake. Those establish, if you will, the two poles from which different Jewish authorities in subsequent centuries will look at it. If you will, if you focus on the fetus not yet being a soul, that's going to be Rashi. That is going to open up a larger sphere of permissibility. If you look at the criteria being that the mother's life must be at stake, that's going to have a more restrictive view of abortion. And again, it's Feldman's analysis who says that these two positions establish the poles from which all subsequent halakhic thought as an aside, let me just say, when I say halakhic thought, I mean that that's people who are, if you will, abiding by and immersed in the Jewish legal world. There was plenty of Jewish thought that will emerge that doesn't necessarily intentionally make itself the next piece of thinking in the Jewish legal tradition. There might be pieces of looking at this from another Jewish perspective in a contemporary way, but it's not necessarily going to be coming it from the Jewish legal position. Just as an aside, these two texts from the Mishnah of Yoma, again around the year 200 of the Common Era, from the Talmud in Yonah around the year 500, they are establishing the other side of things. It has nothing to do with abortion here. It's about when is somebody dead, or when might they be alive? And it clearly establishes the notion that life has to do with being able to breathe. And so I just wanted you to see that the Talmud the tradition is consistent around life begins when you take your breath, and life ends when you take your last breath. And just in terms of medical ethics, for those who are interested, around brain death and other things that affect the harvesting of organs, these are very important texts for that conversation around the end of life. How do we determine the end of life? The Jewish tradition relies upon the breath, not the heart, for end of life considerations. So now the question becomes, what constitutes difficulty in giving birth or danger to the mother? This is a rabbinic, what they call a tshuva, a rabbinic response to a legal question. I'm going to assume that it was a real life scenario, whether the woman was from this rabbi's town or the rabbi received it in a letter from a junior colleague. I don't know the full historic context of this, but this is from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who's in Germany in the beginning and the middle of the 1700s. So he's asked a question about an adulterous married woman who is pregnant. That's a good question, he says. It appears to me to permit her to abort. And even in the case of a legitimate fetus, meaning one that was not born in an adulterous relationship or an illicit relationship, there is reason to be lenient if there is a great need, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge, right? So you can hear Rashi's language influencing this. The fetus hasn't emerged, it's not considered a soul, therefore there's space to be lenient. Even if the mother's life itself, in contrast to Maimonides, who says the pursuer, so her life in this moment is not in jeopardy, but only so as to save her from an associated evil with it that would cause her great pain. Therefore, our ruling is, in general, it is certainly forbidden to destroy a legitimate fetus. But in the case before us of a married woman who has gone astray, I hereby state my humble opinion that is permitted, perhaps it is even worthy of being regarded as a mitzvah, right? So that ending, to say it's a mitzvah, perhaps she's even obligated. That's what the notion of ending it with that line as a mitzvah. Perhaps she's even obligated to have an abortion. This would be considered a classic example, one of the prime examples from the early modern period, the very early modern period of we'll call it a lenient ruling, one that follows the tradition of Rashi that sort of says abortion is permitted. There might be some restrictions that we want to write. Certainly doesn't want to say that it's permitted in every case, because the author is going to say, I'm only ruling in this one. I mean, it's not okay to destroy a legitimate fetus, excuse me. But for this woman, her mental health, what it means to live with this. And I think that Yeah, and then we'll see another take on this. So the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg lives in Jerusalem in the 20th century. So here is another view now from the 20th century from a leading halakhic expert, particularly when it comes to medical issues. However, it makes sense to say that the main reason to permit abortion for an adulterous woman is because of the mother's need to save her in this way from embarrassment and disgrace when her child is born for all her days. This is similar to what She'elat Yavetz, that's the previous opinion we just read, from Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes, afterward to permit even abortion of a legitimate fetus out of great need, even if not pikuach nefesh of the mother, even if the physical health of the mother is not at stake in this moment, we should permit it, rather to save her from evil, which great pain would cause her. For there is no need nor physical and spiritual pain greater for a mother who has done tshuva, she's repented, than that the sin of her illegitimate child will be living reproof constantly. It is simple and clear that if we permit abortion for this reason, then we should permit it in the case of a married woman who is raped, for the child would be illegitimate and would, when conceived by rape. Therefore, it seems that if there is a valid concern that the child will be born deformed or in constant pain, we should permit an abortion within 40 days of conception and at the most up to 3 months, and providing that the fetus is not moving. This is obviously a subset of a much larger conversation, which is, I think, ultimately dealing with the question of abortion around a child that would be born deformed or in constant pain. It doesn't necessarily mention a genetic disease at this stage, but that could be what was going on here. And so based on the idea that it would be the pain caused to the mother, the great need that the mother would incur, which evolves out of Rashi's place. Again, going back to Rashi, the fetus is not yet a soul. So out of that place, the needs of the mother will take precedent, even if she's in non-immortal danger, the physical, but also the mental health of the mother, whether the child was born from an adulterous relationship, rape, or the child would come with deformed or in constant pain. All of those could cause the mother great pain, and therefore we should permit abortion for those instances. As it happens, if you look at the Times of Israel today, the headline in one of the articles in the Times of Israel, Orthodox Jewish divides on abortion come to the fore after Roe v. Wade reversal. U.S. Supreme Court ruling welcomed by Orthodox groups, while many observant Jewish women panic over aftermath of decision, women will die. So we might wonder, you might ask, why, after you've just shown me two leading halakhic authorities, one from the 1700s, the other from the 1900s, who are very clear about their, if you will, the permissibility in these cases for abortion, why would there be any Orthodox Jewish divide? And the reason for that, one of them can be found, is that there is the contrary side of things. There's the Maimonidean perspective, which says the woman must be in mortal danger. If the woman herself is not in mortal danger, then that's the Maimonidean, or a reading of Maimonides, then we don't permit abortion. And while I will not bring you sources, it's because the life itself is sacred, and then therefore the potential life that the fetus represents is also potential sacredness. And there are other Jewish values around the importance of birth and having children. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is the leading halakhic decisor in America in the 20th century. And so if you want to know what American Orthodoxy says, like, he is a key figure. There are obviously different sects within Orthodoxy that follow different leaders, but his work, his writings, and his tshuvot become, if you will, a great foundation for much of American Orthodoxy. And so he writes, It's clear and straightforward. As I wrote, the clear halacha, according to our sages, the medieval ones, the commentators, and the halakhic excisors. In other words, throughout all of history, it's so clear, people, that it's forbidden as actual murder to abort any fetus. Whether legitimate or mamzer would be born of an adulterous or illicit relationship, whether just a fetus or one with Tay-Sachs, all are forbidden by Torah. What? Right? How could you say that? So essentially, I can only speculate to where Rav Moshe is coming from, but his writing suggests that he's taken the Maimonidean position that only when the woman's life is in danger is abortion permitted, and therefore will not permit abortion in the Cape of rape, will not permit the adulterous woman to have an abortion, will not permit taking consideration that the child might be born with a genetic disease or some other condition. So what we have here, I just wanted you to see, is that within the 1700 to the year 2000, if you will, you have a reflection of those earlier opinions of Rashi on the more permissible, lenient side, Maimonides, who can be interpreted more restrictively. Those two viewpoints then are being expressed in the opinions on the first two lenient ones that we read, and then Maimonides would be reflected in the stricter position here of the Igorot Moshe. Just to reinforce this, and just to quote Rabbi David Feldman, whose legal writing on the subject was the basis for most of what I've shared with you. It's his words here. The subsequent legal tradition seems to align itself either to the right in the direction of Maimonides, or it's the left in the direction of Rashi. The first approach can be identified especially with the late chief rabbi of Israel, Isar Unterman, who sees any abortion as akin to homicide, and therefore allowable only in cases of corresponding gravity, such as saving the life of the mother. This approach then builds down from that strict position to embrace a broader interpretation of life-saving situations, which include threat to her health, for example, as well as a threat to her life. The second approach, associated with another former chief rabbi of Israel, Ben Zion Uziel, and others, assumes that no real prohibition against abortion exists, and builds up from that lenient position to safeguard against indiscriminate abortion. Again, so now we have two chief rabbis of Israel reflecting these earlier medieval views of Rashi and Maimonides. Within the debate, within Jewish law, the concept of bodily autonomy doesn't have a place. So I think it's just important to separate the Jewish halakhic discourse from how we might think about it with, if you will, contemporary or our contemporary sense of ethics and morals in American society. So just to quote Rabbi Robert Gordis here, who writes in 1983, it is basic Jewish teaching that no human being is master of his own body because he did not create it himself. Male and female alike have been fashioned by God in his image. It's a mitzvah for us to stay healthy. Our bodies are a gift from God. Our life is a gift from God. We are forbidden to do acts of mutilation to the body. And therefore, the concept of essentially autonomy over our own bodies and the right to decide what we do with our physical bodies, that is broadly absent from Jewish legal thought. The conservative movement in 1983 dealt with this question of abortion. That's why you can see that Feldman writes in 1983, Gordis writes in 1983, and then because there were so many different opinions and ways of looking at this, the conservative movement wanted to issue a statement, and basically in one sentence, the Rabbinical Assembly Committee on Jewish Law and Standards takes the view that an abortion is justifiable if a continuation of pregnancy might cause the mother severe physical or psychological harm, or when the fetus is judged by competent medical opinion as severely defective. And I think this comes out of, if you will, what we've just seen in terms of the Jewish legal tradition. Feldman will indicate that it's really the concern of the mother that we take into account. And so for Feldman's formulation, he'll say, if the woman, and this has to do with a child, the fetus that might be defective or might have Tay-Sachs or some disease that will cause it either to die young or to have a severely compromised life, Feldman would say, if the woman came to the rabbi and said, I'm worried about my child, it has Tay-Sachs and it's going to die, that formulation of the question for Feldman would not permit abortion because it's focused on the fetus and not the mother. Were he to change the question, it's going to cause me great anguish, anxiety, and pain. So much so that I don't know if I'll ever want to have children again, were I to see my child born into this world only to suffer for some months or years and then perish. Then the rabbi, according to Feldman, would grant because the focus has shifted from the concern about the fetus to the concern about the mother's health. I think that this statement here essentially says that's a legal loophole. Let's not get into the way the question is formulated. And therefore, if people are coming to, if the question about whether or not to abort arises, it's because the parents are very concerned, both for the fetus and for themselves. Let me just add then a little bit about where I think Christianity might talk about this. Again, not being a Christian legal expert, if somebody else in the room is, I would welcome their input. But I just want to try to suggest where some of the differences between Judaism and Christianity arise, then we'll open up for questions. So back to these verses from Exodus 21, 22, and 23. The Septuagint is the Jewish Greek translation of the Torah, and then ultimately the entire Hebrew Bible. We date the Jewish translation of the Torah to the 3rd century before the Common Era. And so it's within, if you will, a Greek-Egyptian world that the Torah gets translated for a Greek-speaking Jewish audience. And interestingly enough, it reads differently than the Hebrew. And if 2 men strive and smite a woman with child, and her child be not fully formed. So I don't want to try to get into all of the linguistic explanations, but the Septuagint interprets the Hebrew word ason to mean the formation, to be referring to the formation of the fetus, whereas the Hebrew and all the way Jewish tradition has interpreted it, and many moderns wouldn't read that Hebrew, is that it refers to I think the damage caused to the mother. So suddenly we've introduced language that focuses on the fetus because of this translation versus the language of the mother. He shall be forced to pay a penalty as the woman's husband may lay upon him. He shall pay the fine what's fitting. And then you get, but if the child be fully formed. So because of that language initially, the next verse is translated, a miscarriage has been caused for a child that is fully formed, he shall give life for life. This, I would suggest, is the origin within Western religion that would equate feticide with murder. It's not all killing of fetuses because the verse itself distinguishes between fully formed and formed. But that's very different than what we saw about Rashi and the Jewish view on this topic. Just to give you an example, Philo is a Jew, but to my knowledge, I don't think Philo's writings were either available or influenced. I'm not sure if Philo's writings were available to the rabbis. In other words, I don't think Philo is not a source that is referred to in the Jewish legal tradition, despite the fact that Philo himself was Jewish. So you can see then what Philo writes, and with respect to these matters, the following law has been enacted with great beauty and propriety. If while two men are fighting, one should strike a woman who is great with child, and her child should come from her before it is completely formed, he shall be mulcted, assessed a fine, according to what the husband of the woman shall impose upon him, and he shall pay the fine deserved. But if the child be fully formed, he shall pay life for life. For it was not the same thing to destroy a perfect and an imperfect work. So this is again reinforcing the translation of the Septuagint into perhaps 2 centuries later, 2.5 centuries later, how Philo writes. I'm not enough of an expert on this topic. Some would argue that there are no doubtly people that would argue that the Septuagint got it right. You can find scholars who will argue that. I think the broad consensus would be that the Septuagint was influenced by the Greco-Roman milieu in which it was translated, and it was reflective of some earlier Greek views and values about the creation of life and the concepts of the start of life. But I don't know that topic well enough. It suffices that we see that Septuagint translates it this way. We don't need to answer the why. Philo reinforces the interpretation of the Septuagint. We should not assume that these early Christian sources had the Septuagint as their source. Perhaps they had something else in which they were basing their views or a different verse. But there are definitely early Christian sources that say, thou shalt not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is begotten. Thou shalt not slay thy child by causing abortion, nor kill that which is begotten. So again, there are definitely early Christian sources that equate abortion with murder, at least in some cases. Gordis in 1983, so it's dangerous to quote a Jew teaching Catholic policy, but it seems like it's straightforward enough. Catholic teaching on the subject has fluctuated throughout time. In the 4th century, St. Basil condemned abortion at any stage, but the Code of Justinian in the 6th century exempted from penalty abortions during the first 40 days. This position was reaffirmed repeatedly by papal decree for nearly 10 centuries. In 1588, Pope Sixtus V declared all abortions to be murder, but less than 3 years later, Gregory XIV rescinded his decree. Not until 1869 was the prohibition reinstituted by Pope Pius IX. And it is this position that is now official Catholic doctrine. So if you will, changes back and forth around essentially whether or not there's any permissibility to abortion. The earlier opinions of permissibility would have been in aligned with the Septuagint about fully formed. They would have said, oh, when is fully formed? Fully formed is after 40 days, then it would be considered fully formed. But if it's prior to 40 days, as the Septuagint says, then it's not murder. An anonymous author on a website shares the following, so that St. Augustine feels constrained by the Septuagint text to accept the view that abortion before formation is not homicide. Right? Early abortion is not counted as homicide. While the soul may be present, it's an insensible state. But then you get into later Christian thought in the Reformation era. We're talking the 1500s. And subsequent centuries, a similar understanding continued, but some Christians began treating this passage as referring to fetuses without qualifying their age. In other words, some Christian sources began treating the Septuagint's translation of the Hebrew Bible essentially ignoring the concept of not fully formed. Essentially eliminating it, the time of not fully formed goes down to, if not seconds or minutes, so that everything after some moment of conception would be considered fully formed. And so you see the quote from Calvin: "It ought surely to be deemed more atrocious to destroy a fetus in the womb before it has come to light. On these grounds, I'm led to conclude without hesitation that the words, 'if death should follow,' must be applied to the fetus as well as to the mother." In other words, any form of causing the death of a fetus at any stage, that is considered murder. Okay. That is my attempt to try to provide, if you will, the Jewish legal framework in which Jewish law thinks about abortion, with a little aside as to where Christian thought may have developed. And I'd like to open it up to questions. Okay, I see Rabbi Howie Kasavsky, if you will unmute yourself, and then I see Berman's hand is up.
Thank you. It's interesting that Reb Moshe is taking an incredibly conservative view, saying that under no circumstances is abortion ever allowed. And I have a feeling somehow that what he said in relationship to Tay-Sachs was a reaction personally to me, because about in 1977 or something like that, the conservative rabbi and I, who were down in Columbia, South Carolina, said we wouldn't marry anybody unless they had a Tay-Sachs test. Of course, there were no blood tests in South Carolina when we were living down there. So the idea was, if you had a Tay-Sachs affected baby, that there was going to be an abortion, and the Orthodox movement came at both of us with both barrels blazing, and it might be that Reb Moshe picked up on that, and so take it personally. As to what the Septuagint said, in a sense, they're not necessarily translating, just as Onkelos translates into Aramaic. He's really making a commentary, and it could be that the Septuagint is making a commentary based upon the thought of the era, at the time that the Septuagint is written, and Josephus is like a super commentary on that. So, I think one of the problems is with Orthodox law, with traditional law, is you've got opposite views, and it's a matter of saying, pay your nickel and take your choice.
Great.
By the way, it was a really great presentation you did there. Showing all of these great sources.
Thank you, Rabbi Kasavsky. Just a couple of, I just want to clarify, I think that Rav Moshe would permit abortion were the mother's life to be at issue.
Okay, so one question here.
Right, so just to clarify, but and I do think you're absolutely right that he is responding to probably abortion around Tay-Sachs, and then you can also add as abortion becomes more permissible in general society, then the reactionary of of his strain of religious interpretation becomes more restrictive. And I'll just point out that the analysis, Josephus actually reinterprets the verses in accordance with rabbinic tradition. He precedes the rabbinic tradition. So Josephus and Philo are on opposite interpretations. Josephus reflects the Jewish reading of those verses from Exodus, whereas Philo would reflect the Septuagint's. Elizabeth.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. This is a wonderful, concise presentation, very timely. My question is, were you able to identify, or did you come across any specific responsa or commentary on whether abortion would be permitted in the specific case of rape? Because in our collective Jewish history, we've had a series of pogroms and attacks and assaults on the Jewish people as a whole. So I was wondering if there is anything, especially during the Holocaust or other issues like that.
That's a really good question, and the truth is, one would expect, as you said, to find something. I do not know the breadth of. I did not come across something that that explicitly referenced or its timing would lead me to know that this was result of a pogrom or of the Holocaust. But just to go back to the source of the Tzitz Eliezer, I don't know what year this is. The Tzitz Eliezer is born 1915 to 2006, and I don't know what year this is written, but you know, explicitly is about the woman who is raped and talking about the permissibility. So I don't know I don't have more to say on that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? If you have a question and don't know how to do the yellow hand in the air, you can unmute yourself and ask any question that you know that you'd like to ask. You know, just to conclude, I think the intention of the talk was to present the texts and to present the tradition. Certainly, it's a very personal conversation for anybody that, for any variety of reasons. And you know, if there's a private conversation that anybody wants to have, I'm certainly open and would welcome to talk. Max Friedman, your hand is up.
Yeah, when our Supreme Court made that terrible decision, I did some research. It's specifically associated with what was known as the colonies and then the United States. And it appears that abortion was perfectly acceptable, not only for the Jews, but for the Roman Catholics, until what they called quickening. At that time, they said quickening was when the soul entered the fetus, and at that point, you can no longer do abortions. However, in the 1820s, 1830s, the doctors in the US decided that that was a pretty good way of making money. So they discussed it with the federal government, and that's how they made abortions illegal. So abortion illegality began by the medical profession in the 1850s in the US, solely to create more income. Now, I am amazed when I read that. But before that, even the Catholics believed that quickening was the point at which the soul entered the body. And after that, I mean, the zygote became the position. That single cell little thing that sits in the woman's uterus became a given. And I'm getting beyond myself. I shouldn't be saying that. I just get excited when I read that nonsense. Anyway, for what it's worth.
Thank you for sharing, Max. You know, I found the intellectual history, if you will, and religious history about ensoulment to be a more confusing line of thought, and that therefore I was very intentional to sort of not have that side of it. It would seem Susan Grossman, who is probably the first woman writing, definitely the first conservative rabbi, and therefore I don't know of any Orthodox opinions. I don't know about the Reform movement, and its own approach to halakha is different. But so Susan Grossman, in her tshuva, she quotes a source from, I think, someone who dies in 1244, who talks about ensoulment happening and again, there are different views of this within the Jewish ensoulment happening at conception, but it doesn't reach the status of life. So it's an interesting balance between if you will, allowing for the concept of whatever the soul is to take place within the fetus, but also not then yet establishing that entity as constituting life, and therefore would be consistent with the Jewish tradition in terms of its views that feticide would be permissive. But there's a lot of other things I found pretty confusing about that.
The one thing that always gets me is that we know that until the lungs are formed, life is not permissible for an infant. In other words, lungs is the point at which the infant is potentially able to survive outside the womb.
Yeah.
Before that, so, you know, but then again, I use another word almost. Our politicians don't seem to understand medicine very well.
Yeah, I'm going to call on Lisa Plymouth in just a second. What I did not find a lot of, what I did not find in my quick research into the topic, much within the halakhic discourse that even addresses the concept of viability. There is, as you see, we do have some language here, 40 days, 3 months. I'm not sure where that enters. There are definitely sources within Judaism that talk about if a miscarriage occurs within the first 40 days, it's just considered like water. The fetus is not considered any sort of being. The fetus is just considered water. Yeah. So we definitely have sources about status of early stage of the fetus, but I don't know of anything that talks about. I don't know where the concept of the question around abortion and viability come into play. For me, what I understand very clear in the tradition is that the mother's health is paramount, and the lenient view views both her physical health and her mental health as being part of that conversation, and a more traditional, a Maimonidean view would be restrictive and be more focused primarily on her physical health, but then might make some exceptions from there, as we saw earlier in the summary.
That's interesting, Rabbi, because that means that Judaism is contraindicated to the decisions made by a Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has said that essentially, well, they didn't say this, but the people who interpreted it in the various states had said that life begins at inception, which means that if you choose the mother over the infant, it's murder. Right. If you choose the infant over the mother, it's also murder. So what happens? I don't know the answer to that.
I'm going to ask that you let me get the last word in, Max, so I can get.
I'm sorry. This is the subject that's. I get so mad at people. Never mind. I shouldn't.
Well, I just want to say, since we're not in person, I don't get to see your face. I am so grateful. I don't know if we've met, but I'm grateful that you came to this conversation. If you're local and you want to sit down for a cup of coffee or a scotch, I would love to meet and we can talk about it in person. If anybody else wants to join for a cup of coffee and scotch, all of you are also welcome. I want to extend the invitation very broadly here.
Only if it's a single malt.
You've got it. You got it. Okay, Lisa.
I was born in Glasgow, Scotland.
welcome, Max. So please be in touch so that I can, find a way to be in touch. It would be nice to meet you, Lisa.
Yes, one of the things I've been reading about the Jewish tradition recently that you hadn't really mentioned, and I wondered if you know a source on this, is that in Jewish tradition, the fetus is considered part of the mother's body and an extension of the mother.
Absolutely. You can see that in the Talmud. You see that in rabbinic. So from the Talmud, you can see that. You see the same terminology in Roman code, that the fetus is a limb of the mother.
Okay.
Yeah. But what Feldman says is, he said, despite that, so again, law is its own, way of thinking. So I'm more apt to rely upon how Feldman has laid out the conversation, and that's what I wanted to reflect here. He will say, the fetus is considered a limb of the mother. He'll bring examples within Jewish law of how that comes into play. It comes into play more with the acquisition of an animal. If I go to purchase a cow from you and I pay you for the cow, and then I discover that the cow was with child, do I owe you extra money because I've now purchased both the intent, the mother cow and the potential baby? The answer is no. When you purchase the cow, the fetus was a limb of the mother. That's, you get the entire cow that you've purchased, fetus and mother cow. But then he goes on to say that despite that isn't the direction in which Jewish legal thought around abortion went. It went, as the Talmud goes in its discussion around what is murder, and declares that it's not murder to kill the fetus. Yeah. Anything else on that one, Lisa, or is that?
No, that was.
That's your question. All right. I'd like to call on Lisa's sister, my Aunt Shauna.
Thanks, Michael. Great talk. Really interesting. One of the issues that I've heard is going to be coming up when state legislatures has to do with in vitro fertilization. And some consider that as abortion and some may not. I was wondering if there's any kind of Jewish readout on that one.
I would certainly imagine. Do you mean the permissibility of in vitro fertilization? Because we know that in order to do in vitro fertilization, you're going to have to fertilize multiple eggs.
Right.
Only a subset of those eggs will be attempted to bring to life, and others of those eggs will be destroyed.
Right. I think that's the potential objection to it.
Yeah, I'm certain that there is there's legal sources on the permissibility of it. I don't know about the legal sources that would prohibit it. It would be hard for me to imagine that if there was this concept of, that the fetus is really merely considered water. And I will say, Shauna, you should know that there is a Jewish, I don't think it's a legal, it would be more of a story or a good teaching, but it says that a man who does not engage in procreation is considered like one who has shed blood. In short, not trying to, being abstinent as a male is considered murder because you're not creating life, which is simply a very strong way of expressing the value of life and the creation of life. And I would assume that because of that, there's plenty of legal grounds to stand for the importance of in vitro fertilization. I just don't know what's going to happen on that other side. Yeah, any other questions about this? So
one thought, in Israel, what do they consider abortion or non-abortion or incest or rape? What's their position legally?
Just a second, Max, and I'm going to bring it up for you. Easier for you to see it than for me to say it. 1 second. The law will be from 1977, and while there was recent changes, I'm not, let's see, Benzion backwards. Okay. 1 second. Okay, here we go. The basic Israeli law here is summarized by Gordis. On January 31st, 1977, the Israeli Knesset adopted a new law on abortion that was strenuously opposed by the Orthodox rabbinate and did not please Israeli feminists. Nevertheless, the provisions of the law are both realistic and humane and might well serve as a model for other countries. Here's what your answer. Under Israeli law, abortion is permitted if carried out in a recognized medical institution with the woman's approval and according to one or more of the following criteria. If the birth would endanger the woman's life or injure her physical or emotional health. That sounds very much like our Jewish law conversation. If it can be determined that the child would be born either physically or mentally handicapped. Sounds like our conversation, again, because primarily because of the anguish that it would be caused to the mother. But perhaps a little more expansive than a halakhic reading. If the pregnancy was the result of rape, incestuous relations, or intercourse outside of marriage, we've seen the Jewish legal sources permitting it in those conditions. If the woman is below the age of 16 or over 40.
Huh.
That we have not seen. In that writing of the Israeli law, then a panel of three had to approve that the abortion met one of those criteria. It was two doctors and one social worker, one of whom had to be a woman. In the last week, I don't fully know how Israeli government works, but I think that it was more like a change in regulation rather than a change in legislation. And that within the body of the Knesset that establishes, if you will, regulation, that some leniencies were added to the regulations such that this, again, when Israeli society, again, we're talking secular. We're talking a secular legal approach because it's not bound by halakha. But this notion of a recognized medical institution was expanded to include like local health facilities rather than hospitals or something to that distinction. So it expanded the locations at which a woman could receive an abortion. And I believe that the panel ruling piece was changed. You certainly can Google it. It was in the Washington Post. It was in the Times of Israel. And rather than taking other times, you just need to know that in the last week, regulatory changes were made within Israel to liberalize the policy. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Hadassah magazine also put out in May of this year. So prior to this change, just last week, Hadassah magazine put out an article that talks about this and also then talks about the different views about this, about the law within Israel. So if you're interested in Israeli society, you can Google Hadassah magazine abortion Israel, and you'll find that article from May 2022. Yeah, great. Are there any other comments or thoughts that people would like to share? All right. I really appreciate you taking your time to participate in this. Thanks to those who turn on their video so that I could see your face. It's just a little easier to talk when you see at least one or two faces. And if people want to say goodbye and turn their video on, that's great too. But I'm really just grateful that you took the time to listen in. If you have questions or you want to talk personally or privately, I hope you know how to reach me. I'm available.
And I thank you very much, Rabbi, for the hard work and putting this together for us.
You're welcome, Max.
You've clarified it very well, and also somewhat hard to understand which way we're going. You know, as I said about Jews, 6 Jews, 8 opinions.
Oh, you're sitting on your couch.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks, Aaron, Dan.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Elizabeth, Donna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Don't forget, we got Shabbos tonight, candles to light, wine to drink, maybe scotch. You want to come to shul, we'll be here. You want to zoom in. You want to just have a Shabbat at home, whatever it is, you should have a peaceful, restful, soul-filling, soul-renewing 25 hours, and then get it again next week.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.